We have a shocking update on the future of the New York Islanders, as there's a report the Islanders are considering buying out 2 long-term contracts. In this episode of Islanders Digest, we're going to be really breaking down what this can mean and whether or not it makes sense for the Islanders to buy out these 2 players. But before we get into that, be sure to subscribe to the channel, be one of our first 100 subscribers. If you're an Islander fan and you want more Islanders content, this is the channel for you, so be sure to hit the subscribe button. With that, let's get right into these reports, and there are reports from Arthur Staple on The Athletic that it seems pretty clear that Pierre Engvall will be bought out this offseason. In addition, Scott Mayfield is also a possibility to be bought out for the Islanders, and if they do buy out both these players, they will be getting $4.3 million for the next 5 years to spend on other players. Now, I'm going to halt the brakes right here. I know that $4.3 million does sound really nice, but there are consequences to buying out players. There's a reason why every offseason Islander fans talk about buying out players, and it never happens. And that's because buying out players is not free. And I'm not even going to really focus on the part that the Islanders, if they would buy out players, would have to spend additional, at least ownership would have to spend additional money towards their salary cap. That's not even the issue here, because I feel like the Islanders owners have no issue spending more money if it means the team is going to be better. The real issue here comes that there's a consequence long term for buying out those players. Just because you get some salary cap relief in the short term, you do have to pay it back in the long term. And if any franchise understands those consequences the most, it is the Minnesota Wild. After buying out Zach Parise and Sutter, they had a lot of money in the short term to spend, but in the past few years, they've really been paying that money back because they could not spend that money in the future for their current roster, and as a result, they could not be as competitive in free agency and really feel the best team as they possibly could because they were dealing with the consequences of those buyouts. That being said, I do think it makes sense to buy out at least Pierre Engvall, and I'm going to really break through why as we look at this contract and what a buyout would look like thanks to the Puckapedia buyout simulator, with Pierre Engvall making $3 million for the next 5 years. And that's really the shocking part of this buyout rumor, not to get off track, but the fact that these contracts were both signed 2 seasons ago, they're 7-year contracts, and now we're already talking about buying them out. It's kind of crazy to think about. That being said, while I will criticize Lou for signing the contracts, if he does decide to buy them out, especially with Pierre Engvall, you do have to commemorate accepting a mistake and really just doing what's best for the team. As you'll see here, by buying Pierre Engvall out for the next 5 seasons, the Islanders will get $2 million back on their salary cap. That is a lot of money that can spend elsewhere. I will note, though, from 2030 to 2035, they would be losing $1 million on the salary cap. So this is not free money, and this is why you don't see teams doing this every day, because especially with larger contracts, contracts with bigger numbers, you really lose a decent amount of money in the future when you buy out a player. That being said, with Pierre Engvall, with it only being $1 million, we're going to take a look at his stats. I think this is actually a pretty good deal for the New York Islanders, especially considering by the time they will be losing that $1 million in their contracts, in their salary cap. The salary cap would have already gone up. I don't think it's going to be as consequential, just $1 million. At that point in time, $1 million will not even be enough money to sign a single player to an entry-level contract if the salary cap continues to go up the way it is. So because of that, I really don't see the consequence of doing this for Pierre Engvall. I think it can actually be really good to get $2 million to spend on something that's actually useful for the roster. Pierre Engvall, I do understand why the contract was signed. His first 2 seasons at least his first season with the Islanders, he really was effective. I mean, he looked like he was going to be a half-point-per-game player, and he was really impactful. He also played pretty well going into the playoffs. This is a player that I was excited about, and I was not upset when the contract was signed. And I really should have been, because next year, Pierre Engvall took a big step back, only getting 28 points in 74 games. And the big issue with this was he was playing on good lines. He was playing a lot of time with Brock Nelson and Kyle Palmieri. So the fact that he was only getting 28 points was really frustrating. In addition, he's a big player, but he does not use his body, which is really why I think it is so important for the Islanders to consider buying him out. You look this season, he took another step back, 43 games played. He is playing more of a 4th-line role. He has 8 points. And my biggest issue is not even the points. If Pierre Engvall was on the 4th line, committed to his role, really back-checking, really skating hard, just trying to provide some value to the team, I would argue you should not buy him out, especially for what you'd be getting back in return. He is only making $3 million. It's not that hard to play a game that is worth $3 million. Pierre Engvall is not doing that. He is really providing this Islanders team no value. He's not hitting. He's kind of just skating around in circles on the 4th line, really making the 4th line almost unplayable at its worst. I really do think it makes sense for the Islanders to buy this player out, because a big thing you have to consider is when you buy a player out, you do have to spend money to replace them. I think you can find for $1 million a fourth line player who will do a lot better. Honestly, I would not hate to see Danny Nelson take that role next season, a rookie. Give him a chance to really shine in the NHL. He will definitely play better than Pierre Engvall is playing currently on the fourth line. I think this is an easy decision. The one thing I will say is that the Islanders think they're in a situation where they don't need that $2 million next season. If they are going to be under the salary cap, maybe it makes sense to wait to buy him out, send him down to the AHL, because when you send him down to the AHL, the Islanders will still save $1 million, at least approximately $1 million, enough money to spring up another contract to the National Hockey League. So maybe it makes sense to wait until you absolutely need that money. That way you're kind of shortening how long you're going to have the consequences of this buyout. For example, if they wait till 2027, 2028 season to buy him out, then they'd really only have to suffer with the buyout until 2023 as opposed to 2035. Just something to, not 2033 instead of 2035. Just something to consider. Now, with Scott Mayfield, I know a lot of fans are done with Scott Mayfield. I'm not quite done. I don't think it makes as much sense to buy out Scott Mayfield. With Scott Mayfield's contract, he's currently making $3.5 million, and I think this is definitely a case where if Scott Mayfield was making $3.5 million for the next 2 seasons or 3 seasons, fans would really not be giving that much hate towards this player. They still wouldn't like him, but they would not be as frustrated with this contract. Scott Mayfield is a player, as I'm going to go really quickly show his stats. He does provide value to this team. I think he provides more value than people think. This season, he has 2 goals, 5 assists, 7 points, and yeah, those are not really big numbers. That's actually the same amount of numbers as Pierre Engvall. Granted, he has played more games. He's a defenseman, though. Really shows you how ineffective Pierre Engvall has been. But the really big takeaway I want you to look at right here is Scott Mayfield is a defenseman, and he is a plus 14. He's a player who plays hard, he checks, he's physical. You might not like the way he looks on the ice, but other players on other teams will tell you he is not fun to play against. Just ask Kucherov what he thinks of playing against Scott Mayfield. And I do want to say, defensemen like this typically are not liked by fans. A lot of you ask any fan base, they absolutely hate the defenseman who is playing on their third pair, because compared to their other defensemen, they look slower, they look less efficient, and when Scott Mayfield does get beat, he looks really bad. The amount of times he has been turned around, given up a breakaway, it's hard to watch at points, but that plus 14, especially considering as we look quickly at the Islanders standings right now, the Islanders are a negative player, a negative 15 team. The fact that this player is a plus 14 playing on a negative team shows you that Scott Mayfield is not the problem. Scott Mayfield is not the reason why the Islanders are not in a playoff spot right now. If anything, his plus 14 is a sign that maybe he is a part of the solution. And while I don't love everything Scott Mayfield does, it's really hard to argue with the fact that at a cap hit of $3.5 million, at least right now, he is not dragging this team down. Now, you can make the argument later down the line he can cost the Islanders more, especially as he ages, and that's a fair argument. And maybe we can talk about buying him out then. Right now, I don't think it makes sense to buy out this player. Now, he has been scratched, not been playing as many minutes lately. I don't think that's because the Islanders don't value him. I think that's because he's coming back from injury, and right now, because the Islanders have so many defensemen, they can afford to play somebody else like Boquist instead of Scott Mayfield. I do think Scott Mayfield comes back next season. I don't think it makes sense to buy him out. And if the Islanders do decide to move on from Scott Mayfield, I still don't think the right decision would be to buy him out. As you can see, $3.5 million, it is a decent amount of money, but it's not too much money, and the Islanders could definitely move this, because realistically, there are other teams out there who would be willing to pay, at least now, $3.5 million for Scott Mayfield. They might not be willing to pay it in a few years, 2029, when he is 37, but they are willing to pay it right now. So I think what will happen with this is the Islanders will hold on to Scott Mayfield. And if they do decide to move on from him, I don't think they buy him out. I think they try to find a trade. And as an Islander fan, you might be thinking right now, like, who would want to trade for Scott Mayfield? And I will tell you who wants to trade for Scott Mayfield. Every year in the playoffs, you have a team that gets bounced really early because their defense was really soft and just let in too many. It was not hard to play against. And those teams often overreact and try to find a strong physical defenseman like Scott Mayfield. I mean, you just saw in the trade deadline, several teams traded for players like this player. I think if Scott Mayfield only had 1 or 2 years on his contract, he probably would have gotten a big haul on the trade deadline. I think what will happen is a team will need a defenseman like Scott Mayfield, and the Islanders might not even have to eat too much of that salary. If the Islanders can find a trade where they just eat $1 million of this salary, and they can trade him off to another team, that would be the perfect scenario because they're still getting the benefits they would get from a buyout, and they don't have to deal with the consequences. And I definitely think that is likely because while the Islanders fans do hate Scott Mayfield, I will tell you, he has definitely not been the main problem this season. Honestly, he has not been a problem this season. Looking at the stats, I know he can be frustrating to watch. Every team has this defenseman where they cannot stand watching them play. And what I always have to say is, yeah, but there's another defenseman lower on the system who is going to provide even worse defense. And that's definitely one last thing you have to consider when you're moving Scott Mayfield. If you're moving Scott Mayfield, can you replace him? On this free agency, can you find a defenseman for $2.3 million that will play better than Scott Mayfield? I don't know if you can. Maybe you can find a younger player and trade for them that can provide better defense for Scott Mayfield, and then it makes more sense to buy him out. But for $2.3 million, I don't think you find a better defenseman than Scott Mayfield on the market, at least a better defenseman than him right now. Because of that, I don't think it makes sense to buy him out. That being said, let me know what you think. Do you want to see the Islanders buy out Pierre, Engvall, and Scott Mayfield? Or do you think they should retain one, buy out the other? Or do you think they shouldn't buy out either one of them, especially considering there would be consequences down the road in 2030? I would love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments. As always, if you're not already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And as always, let's go Islanders.